Europe swelters, the Far East floods, rip-off degrees, and is Keir Starmer too timid? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Sir Robert Goodwill, Labour MP Darren Jones, Director of the Equiano Project Inaya Folarin Iman, and Politics Joe's political correspondent Ava Santina. On today's programme...
It's really different. It's very, very hot.
Heat storms hit southern Europe. Are we moving fast enough on climate change?
Students who go to university have got a right, given the investment they make, to ensure they get good skills, good jobs when they come out.
Are students being ripped off by some university degrees? Why is Keir Starmer finding it so difficult to answer this question?
I'll ask again, do you think that public services in this country need more money if they're to improve?
Well, a Labour government always will invest in our public services.
That's not my question.
Should you be able to pass on a house like this to your children without paying inheritance tax? And why are so many young people lonely?
I'm lonely, and when I felt chronic loneliness, I felt like the walls were caving in on me.
Well, let's start with the heatwave and sweltering temperatures that have been gripping southern Europe and also parts of the United States and Canada. You can see here the heat spots right across Europe, particularly in the south and going eastwards. 46 degrees there in southern Spain. That's today. Tomorrow, the temperatures are much the same, over 40 degrees in most parts of southern Europe. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Sir Robert, is the government moving fast enough on climate change?
Well, I think, the main thing is to understand that we do recognise that climate change is an issue. There's still a few sort of conspiracy theorists that are going around peddling that it's all a big conspiracy, but we do need to take action. And actually, if you look at what the UK has done, we've reduced our emissions by 40% since the base year of 1990, and we're phasing out gasoline and diesel cars. We're moving to more renewable energy.
But is it fast enough? I mean, you will know Lord Debden, who has been the chairman of the Climate Change Committee, saying to the government set this up, that the government's biggest failures was not putting net zero at the heart of the UK's planning system, the failure to act decisively in response to the energy crisis. Yes, taking into account some of the things that you've said, but that actually they have got to do far more now or miss their net zero targets.
Well, we certainly need to do far more now. We need to make our buildings more sustainable, and that's not just new buildings with better insulation and more sustainable heating systems. It's what we do to the majority of buildings that people live in, are old buildings that were built sometimes centuries ago. So yes, we do need to do more. We need to make our housing stock more sustainable. But, the UK is actually in the vanguard of countries making steps in this direction.
Up until now, I mean, Keir Starmer's rode back on rather a lot of the commitments that he made in terms of the £28 billion investment to tackle climate change. That's still going to happen, he says, if there's a Labour government, but not right at the very beginning. And the same on not turning down oil and gas licences now. He'll keep those in place if they pass before a Labour government comes in.
I don't think he's rode back on policies. I think on the 28 billion...
He's watered them down.
Well, no, I think on the 28 billion, what we've said is that it takes time to spend money effectively. And you can't spend 28 billion overnight in year one. But to answer your primary question, are we moving quickly enough? No, that's why it's one of the Labour Party's top missions to decarbonise the power sector by 2030. And the world isn't moving too quickly either. It's not just a UK problem, it's a global problem. And the tragedy is that we knew that extreme weather would be a problem. And the tragedy is upon another tragedy in that we knew about all of this from the 1970s and people haven't moved quickly enough since then.
What would you like to see done now?
There's a whole host of things that needs to be done. We've got COP28, the international summit, coming up at the end of the year, where the world needs to move much more quickly together. But the UK needs to remain being a leader in this space. We need to stop arguing about onshore wind turbines. We need to decarbonise our housing. We need to get off of gas. We know what we've got to do. The government just needs to move more quickly.
Is the government moving fast enough on climate change?
Well, I think that dealing with the climate crisis is really important, but I think it's also important to do it in a way that's sustainable for our security, but also our economy. So, for example, we are experiencing the war in Ukraine at the moment, and we had Europe dependent on oil and gas from Russia for very long, which meant that actually a lot of their policies in approaching Russia was in two minds because of actually trying to balance their other needs. So I think that we need to make sure that if we're doing that, we're also considering how that's going to impact us in terms of our different energy sources. And we know that wind and solar, for example, are intermittent energy sources. When the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, they are not producing energy in the same way. And so the government was very slow when it came to nuclear. Many people have seen the video of Nick Clegg 10 years ago saying that we're not going to go for a new nuclear power plant because it's going to take 10 years. And then 10 years later, we don't have that and we don't have the energy. So I think they should go much faster, much harder when it comes to nuclear, which is a really reliable and very good source for actually reducing carbon.
Can any of the parties be relied upon to move quickly enough on climate change if that's what's needed?
Well, I mean, I think the big issue is that China is probably the largest contributor to climate change across the world. And our issue is that Biden and China need to talk about this, and they aren't. And our influence has significantly depleted over the past few years with America, which means our Prime Minister is not on the world stage talking to Biden and talking to China about how we're all going to get involved together. But I do take a little bit of issue with what you just said about wind turbines. I think, there's a lot of talk about how wind isn't sufficient, solar isn't. Yes,
they are intermittent energy sources.
Yes, but we need to be working on a portfolio. So that doesn't mean
agree.
It means we can open no new oil fields, but it also means that we can open many new wind farms, many new solar.
Do you support nuclear?
I do actually, yeah, but I mean, it's a long-term plan, isn't it? I mean, 10, 15 years, it's a lot of money, and we're not there right now.
But we also need politicians that are thinking about the long term, and I think that actually when we go for nuclear, which we didn't 10 years ago, which could have provided the energy sources, that would have actually provided that long-term energy security.
But we should have been doing it, 40 years ago, realistically? I mean, 30 years ago.
But where we are now, looking at the pictures that we've just shown our viewers of the extent of these sort of climate crises over the world, should the government be having more honest conversations with the public here about the sacrifices they may have to make?
I think there's two different conversations happening, right? So in the immediate conversation we need to be having is about how we're going to deal with heat waves. So right now in America, there are homeless people being treated for third-degree burns because it is so hot out. We need to be talking about cooling areas. We need to be talking about better housing, better roofing, insulation.
Adaptations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think also we need to bear in mind that, gas will have a part to play as we make this transition.
For how long?
And for the next 20 years, probably. But as we, move away from we've virtually abandoned coal to produce electricity here, which is great news. But as we build the nuclear power stations, as we develop the other renewables, we will need gas. And the question is, should we have gas from the North Sea, which is secure and close and affordable, or should we just import gas from across the world, which often is produced using fracking, which many people are against? So I think it's important that we do continue to exploit the North Sea. And also, by the way, get our coal that we need to make the steel to make the wind turbines from West Cumbria, not from the other side of the world.
Darren, do you agree with that?
No, not really. I mean, we need to get off of gas as quickly as possible.
Right.
And
so when is that?
Well, it depends what else you do. I mean, Ava's right, it's the portfolio. Why the government is still arguing about onshore wind turbines is beyond me. Why we can't get on with getting small nuclear modular reactors plugged into the grid is beyond me. Why the government set up a new Department for Energy but can't seem to move quicker than it did before is beyond me. If we get all of these things done better, then we can get off of gas, whether it's imported from America or Russia, as quickly as we can.
Just a quick point on the idea of that we need to make sacrifices. I also think we need to remember that we are in a cost of living crisis, partly spurred on by exorbitant energy costs. And I think that when people talk about making sacrifices, oftentimes it is the poorest in society that disproportionately impact from the kind of sacrifices that are made. And we see that with a lot of the debates about ULEZ, where people that rely on their
emission zone.
Exactly, and people that rely on their cars, for example, manual labourers for all sorts of reasons, will have higher costs. So I think we need to think about how the impact is spread.
ULEZ is about air pollution, it's not about climate change.
But I think it's about the wider conversation about sacrifices when it comes to
so that young children
policies.
don't get asthma and don't choke to death on diesel fuel. That's why we have it.
I think that's fine, but we also have to care about how that's going to impact people's pay packet and if that's going to be difficult for people. That's what part of the wider balance
very favourably.
I think it's part of the wider considerations that politicians have to make about the impact of their policies.
All right, we're going to move on and talk about Sir Keir Starmer. You saw him there in the headlines. It was a clip from Sunday with Laura Kunsberg from yesterday. Let's have a look at a little bit more.
Do you think that public services in this country need more money if they're to improve?
Well, a Labour government always will invest in our public services.
That's
That's
not
what
my
we
question.
did in
Would
record.
a Labour government spend more money on public services?
Labour governments always invest in our public services. But I don't want to lose this point, Laura, because one of the big problems of the last 13 years is that there hasn't been any long-term thinking. There hasn't been the reform to go with it.
But I want to press you on this specific point, because people in your party want to know, people who work in the public services want to know, would a Labour government spend more money on public services? Do you believe, after years of saying austerity has damaged the public sector, do you believe that part of the answer has to be more money?
A Labour government will always want to invest in its public services.
That's not an answer to my question.
Well, the way to invest in our public services is to grow our economy.
Let's just try it with Darren. Why doesn't he just say no? A Labour government will not spend more money on our public services.
So I think there are two things that are true. The first thing is that if Labour comes into government in the next election, the government bank accounts are in a mess. The credit card is maxed out. The interest rate's gone through the roof.
We've heard all these phrases before, haven't we?
Yeah, but actually they really are at this time compared to what the country was left with after Labour government in 2010. But let me finish my first point. So the credit card's maxed out, the interest rate's through the roof. We don't have enough money coming into the bank account every month to pay the bills, which means more borrowing. That is true. The second thing that's true is that we are spending more than ever before as a government, and we're taxing more than ever before as a government. So the question is, how do you spend the money that we do have more efficiently? And that's why the question's about reform.
Right, so there shouldn't be any more money spent on public services. That is what Keir Starmer wouldn't say, but means, and you are saying.
I'm saying we shouldn't spend more money until we spend the money we're currently spending better, which is why we need to reform our public services and make them more efficient.
Right, well, why isn't he saying that?
You'll have to ask Keir that question. I mean, I think what he's...
do you think he sounds evasive when he's answering those questions?
Well, I think what he's trying
I
think what he's trying to say is that Labour as a party obviously supports the public services that we created. We're really proud about our legacy on the National Health Service, the Open University, you know, getting more people into higher education and so on and so forth. But he's recognising the economic reality that we'll be inheriting and being very honest with the public about that.
What did you think, Ava, when you saw that clip?
Well, it's quite a concerted move, I suppose, to small c conservatism, and I don't actually think that's what the country wants at the moment. I mean, most of the polling shows that the reason Labour are ahead is because they don't like the Conservatives. It's not because of anything that Starmer is actually putting down. And arguably, you know, he's talking about we'll invest in public services after we get the economy back on track. Well, you can't get the economy back on track unless you invest in public services. It's an incredible catch-22.
Well, you can get the private sector moving whilst reforming public services. There are things that we can do in the private sector on skills, on productivity, on technology, supporting businesses to improve their exports, which will get the economy growing, which will then result in some more money coming into our bank account in order to pay for public services. So there's a whole economy piece, and it's very complicated, it's very hard, and it's going to take time to turn it around because the country's in such a mess.
But you sound like a Conservative when you say that.
I don't think I am, because we're talking about reform. We're not saying the status quo is OK. We're saying things have to change, and we've got those 5 missions, which I think are very bold for the country.
Is that, though, what Keir Starmer wants to project? Sound like a Conservative?
Well, I mean, I think Ava is right that actually, according to some of the things that Keir Starmer has said over the last few days, he is to the right of the public when it comes to economic issues. But, I mean, I'm quite happy to see Keir Starmer talking about growth. But at the same time, he really shows that when it comes to the political economy, he's not going to be radically different to the Conservatives. And I think that that's not the kind of standing that he wants to be in the election, where it's essentially just because nobody likes the Conservatives anymore, as Ava said, that we should just vote for the Labour Party.
The important question that any politician of any party has to answer is, if you're going to promise something, how are you going to pay for it and how are you going to deliver it? And Keir is just being very honest with the public about the state of the country's books. It makes it very difficult.
But in a cost of living crisis, I think people do want to see radical policies, a vision that's going to give people a sense that actually there's going to be change that's going to be on the horizon. I think that there's nothing that Keir Starmer said in that particular question that would give any indication that anything's going to be different.
Sure, but the 5 missions, I think, are very bold missions on economic growth. I'll go through all of them.
No one's going to disagree with the very general 5 statements.
It is by its very definition change, isn't it? An incoming Labour government will want to turn the country around for all of the ills that we probably all agree with. All I'm saying is that being in government is hard, and when the country's been left in such a mess after 13 years, you can't just fix these things overnight, and we're just being very honest with the public about that.
I think Keir Starmer may sound like a Conservative, but he certainly isn't a Conservative, not least because he was content to serve in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. I think Darren's absolutely right. We need to get better value for money from the extra resources that we are putting into public service, particularly the health service. And I think the last thing the health service needs is another big review. I think the worry I would have if a Labour government came into power, that they would they would pander to some of the demands for high inflation-busting wage demands, and we'd find a lot of that extra money going into...
What evidence has there been of that so far from Labour?
Well, Labour haven't been in power for a long time.
But what indication has there been?
Well, they're very close to the unions. They've been criticising us for not accepting some of these. You know, they haven't condemned the rail workers or the doctors for asking for, 35% pay rise. For goodness sake, I've not yet to meet a single person who think that's a reasonable bid for a pay rise.
Darren?
I think if you were to ask the trade unions, they would rather Labour was doing more of what Robert's suggesting that Labour should be doing. But again, Labour's just being honest with everybody about the state of the country's books. And when it comes to public sector reform, as Keir said in the Observer article yesterday, it's not about top-down reform or reorganisations. It's about really getting into the hard work about reforming the efficiencies in our system so that we can deliver public services better.
But what does that mean,
Let me give you an example.
Reform?
Let me give you an example. Your banking app over the last few years, you don't have to go into the branch anymore. You don't have to cash cheques.
Well, it doesn't exist, my branch anymore.
No, and that's a separate issue.
You don't have to buy a ticket at the ticket office at the railway station either, do you?
But you can do everything you want to on your banking app in a very efficient way that works for the user, that's reduced the cost of running the service. That could happen in lots of different ways across public services that will reduce the cost of running those services and then free up money to be able to spend on more frontline delivery.
You mean like ticket offices at railway stations where people can buy their tickets on an app and free up those people from selling your tickets to actually help passengers doing other things?
There's a big issue about digital exclusion with reform, and you always have to make sure that people that can't use the apps have access as well. But you can do both.
Can you?
You can do both.
Yeah. So it works for the health service but not for ticket offices?
That's not what I said. I said you can do reform and ensure that everyone has access to services at the same time.
Isn't there a problem for you, Robert, at the next election? If Keir Starmer, as you say, is sounding like a Conservative, and Ava certainly thinks
Tony Blair did the same thing.
And he won a landslide in 97 and he continued to win 2 more elections. So is there a problem for you?
Well, I think we've got a challenge to demonstrate that the Labour Party, haven't lost their spots and that they will instinctively...
Tony Blair's or...?
Well, don't forget Gordon Brown. Tony was very busy on foreign policy, but he let Gordon Brown spend money we didn't have.
Have you seen the accounts, Robert? The national debt from 2010 to now has gone through the roof.
We have had a pandemic.
Before the pandemic, before Brexit, before the energy crisis,
pandemic, and we've
national
also
debt went up in this country year after year after year. That's why Labour can't do as many things as it wants to do now, because of the record of the Conservative government.
And is that why you're standing down, Robert?
I'm standing down because I'm pension age. And
that hasn't stopped a lot of your other colleagues, and people make different choices. But is there another reason you're standing down?
No, I decided when I was going to stand down when I arrived here in 2005, when I decided to put more money into my pension so I could retire at 66. So, it's not something I've decided recently. And it was also a deal I made with my wife, by the way, that I wouldn't go on for on and on and on. She wants to see a little bit of me in retirement. So we'll see how that works out. But
well, you've obviously planned ahead. Let's just show you the Sunday Times headline, which came as a surprise, I think. Did it come as a surprise to you? Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, I'm resigning from politics at the next cabinet reshuffle. So stepping down from the cabinet and then stepping down altogether at the election. What was your reaction?
Well, Ben came in when I came in, and, there'll be pasture's news for him. I mean, it's not unusual. People like Jeff Hoon, I know, who was Defence Secretary, moved on for a very lucrative career in the defence manufacturing sector, so who knows what Ben might be looking at. And I think he was very disappointed that the job with NATO seems to have been excluded from it. He's been a great NATO Secretary-General, and I think it's a great shame. And so I can understand, he's not going to go in that direction, so he's probably looking at new directions after the election.
A loss to the Cabinet?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Ben has been a superb Defence Secretary. He's a superb Security Minister as well, so it will be lost. But there's plenty of other talent there that the Prime Minister can call on.
Let's just show you this headline. Let's go back to economic policies, or welfare policies in this case. Labour would keep 2-child benefit cap, says Keir Starmer. Leader says party in power will stick with Tory policy seen as driving low-income families into deeper poverty. Do you agree with that?
It's hard, isn't it? None of us in the Labour Party...
It is for the Labour Party, yeah.
Well, no, it's hard for everybody, because none of us want to be in a position where we can't lift the cap. I mean, I benefited from these payments when I was growing up, and so did my sister. So I know the difference they can make to family incomes when you're on very low income. But the fact of the matter, to go back to my previous answer, is that to do that will cost about £1.3 billion a year. So if we're going to commit to that, you have to find the £1.3 billion from somewhere else in order to fund it. And what Keir has been saying this weekend is we're not in a position yet to be able to do that, which is why he talks about the need for economic growth and to increase the amount of money coming into the government.
But Labour opposed this policy when we brought it in.
Yeah.
Labour, if Labour had been in government...
We don't want it there, but what we're saying is that we can't afford right now to lift the cap.
What is Labour in a position to do then? That's kind of the natural follow-up question.
Well, the 5 missions we've talked about are bold, but they recognise the fact that the structural problems in this country are hard.
But what is Labour in a position to do?
Decarbonise the power sector by 2030, reform the education system so there's opportunity. Government isn't just a bank.
Surely
Government
reforming the education sector would involve lifting, what, 1 million children out of poverty?
That's one of the things we would love to do, absolutely. But we've also talked about how you reform the childcare system so that more parents can be in work and more children get support before school. Being in government isn't just about being a bank and spending money, though that is important. It's also about regulation, it's also about legislation, it's also about design of public services. And look, the hard reality is that the country is in a deep mess. And as someone that asks difficult questions every week, I can tell you it can be quite difficult to ask the right questions. It's even harder to give you the right answers when you're in this difficult situation. And the Labour Party is just being honest with the public. If we had a blank cheque, there'd be loads of things we would like to do, but we don't.
But isn't that a get-out of jail card? I mean, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, is very clear. The obscene and inhumane 2-child cap must go, as must the 5-week wait. Jonathan Ashworth, also in the shadow cabinet, is saying the same. The party's split on this.
Well, none of us in the Labour Party want to keep the cap, but Angela Rayner would have said that before Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng completely crashed the economy.
So principles are being shed here
It's
at
not-
the
it's not-
altar.
it's- no, no, no.
If you think it's important
It's not
enough.
principles, it's practical reality about what you can do day to day with the money you have coming in whilst not trying to increase the national debt.
But perhaps
we
that's
have
the
to be
issue.
prudent about that.
Perhaps that's the issue, because, you know, Keir Starmer's famous sticking plaster politics phrase, I think that this is kind of applying to his policies as well, because arguably you would think if I'm looking at a long-term plan for the country, I would look at the children and I would think they need free school meals if they need them, and they need to lift this 2-child benefit cap in order to create children who go on to, you know, create a thriving economy.
I understand, but it's actually the opposite of what he's saying. What he's saying with the 5 missions and what he's been saying this weekend is that the long-term answers to these problems will take time to implement. You can't just turn the country around quickly. So it would be very easy for us to just say, oh, we would love to do this on day one, even though we don't know how to pay for it. He's taking the difficult choices now, laying out the difficult missions that will take time to turn the country around to say that we want to get away from sticking plaster.
Whereas the government is suggesting this, Robert, in the Times. Inheritance tax could be scrapped. We've never heard this before. In Tory bid for votes, flagship policy is aimed at saving seats in the South. Is this a priority?
Well, it's certainly not in my constituency. Very few people pay inheritance tax at all in my part of the world. The house prices are nothing like they are in London. So certainly if I was speaking, as I am, on behalf of people in Scarborough and Whitby, I think there are other priorities. But I think remember when George Osborne, do you remember when we nearly had that election when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister? He announced we were going to scrap inheritance tax.
He did.
It was very popular. Now, whether that popularity would continue when people actually worked out that this isn't really going to have much effect on me, I don't know. But certainly as far as...
so if you were writing the manifesto
England,
for the next election, you wouldn't be suggesting this?
I wouldn't be lobbying the Chancellor to scrap inheritance tax. I can think of other ways of helping people, particularly in the north, where we need to do more to help struggling families.
Are you in favour of this policy, Anna?
I think there is a fair discussion to be had about the threshold. So currently, I think the threshold's at 325,000, and actually,
Twice, if you
yes, and it can go up to 1 million. But anyway,
Yeah,
which is why it doesn't affect that many people.
Yeah, but it means that a lot of people that are asset rich but cash poor, for example, one of their family members dies, you know, they inherit a house that's really the average price in the southeast and actually get hit with a really big inheritance tax bill. So I don't think it should be scrapped. I think people can look at the threshold. But in terms of priorities, I think it sends completely the wrong message at this time.
Oh, right. So you do think it sends the wrong message. I think individually and as a couple, if you're living in that house, you want to leave it to your kids, it's 500,000. So, I mean, it is a highish threshold. If it were to be brought in, would you reinstate it?
Well, I doubt that we'll be supporting this policy.
No, but let's say let's say inheritance tax was scrapped, or you wouldn't want to support it. Would you ever put it back in?
Well, it's not my decision, but I assume not. No, I assume we would. Sorry, the other way around.
Yes.
I assume we would put it back in because one of the huge problems that we have in our country around inequality is people's wealth is tied up in their assets, and so you do need to be able to redistribute some of that tax through measures like inheritance tax.
It is quite popular, though, the idea of scrapping inheritance tax for many people, particularly in the South. So politically, you can see the attraction for the Conservatives.
But you've got to ask yourself, I mean, does a house or an asset appreciating in value, is that a reason for you to keep that money? I mean, typically houses go up in value for 2 reasons. It's because the services around that area have improved greatly, and that's government investment, or it's because supply is so poor, again, lack of government investment. That's the reason your house is so expensive. I think if we were looking more maybe at a model of if you are, you know, a certain type of wealth, then perhaps you pay for your own adult social care, or you know, you can't rely on the state as much as people who are in retirement currently do, then maybe we could look at abolishing it. But right now, it just seems unfathomable to me that, you know, £7 billion it's going to cost to abolish it.
People with assets already pay for their adult social care anyway.
Yes.
And when they sell the house, that money's used.
They are still entitled to a winter fuel allowance,
as sort of like
free bus
theft. You know, they
cards.
see people who've not made provision for their retirement. They may have spent their money on all sorts of wonderful things during their lifetime, but they don't have any money in retirement. They get the state picking up the bill, whereas if you've saved money, you put it into investments, you bought a house, you ultimately have to pay, and that is something that people get very angry about.
And they do get angry about it. Why is it such a hot issue, inheritance tax? It's talked about so much. Policies don't tend to change. Why is it so important to so many voters?
I mean, I think that we live in a kind of country which I think, understandably so, there is this rightful sense that you do the right thing, you save up, you put your money into a house, and that you can leave something for your children. But I think the reason why it is also so divisive as well is that we do have a problem of huge intergenerational inequality at the moment, where whole sections of young people will perhaps never get on the housing ladder, or at least will get on the housing ladder way into their kind of 40s and 50s. And so this sense that people have a lot of money and they can pass it on, and that can exacerbate inequality, I think contributes to a sense of unfairness.
And young people as well. I mean, you're looking at young people are paying, what, 48% tax in real terms if they've gone to university. That is the graduate tax that is on them. So you think, well, why on earth are people with assets? Why are they getting tax relief and I'm paying through the nose? It seems ridiculous.
I would say that obviously, if you've got assets, some of that is your taxed income. You bought the house for £300,000. Some of it is a capital gain. And I think, you know, if we were to abolish Inheritance Act, maybe we should look at capital gains on people's homes because and other assets. I think it's a dangerous area to get into. But actually, you know, people say, you know, I've paid tax on this money already. Yes, you have, but not on the capital appreciation.
Darren?
Let's take the young people kind of example. We know there's a huge intergenerational inequality. So if we were to scrap something like inheritance tax, where a small number of people inherit enormous amounts of wealth from their parents without that being redistributed in some way, in some measure, through the public sector to help people that need a leg up, then I just think people will look at that and think it's hugely unfair and not right for a country like ours.
Well, while we're talking about young people, let's just show you this tweet from Rishi Sunak. Too many students are being sold a university education that won't get them a decent job at the end of it. So I'm cracking down on rip-off degrees and boosting apprenticeships to ensure students get the best deal possible, widening access, boosting jobs, growing the economy. What does this crackdown look like, Robert?
Well, I mean, I was slightly concerned when Tony Blair announced he wanted 50% of students to go to university. And I've had letters from constituents complaining, for example, well, I only get 3 hours contact time a week. I'm paying, you know, £9,000 fees every year. And what's more, you know, the degree I'm studying for doesn't necessarily lead me into a high-paid job. So I think it's important that we do look at this.
Yes.
Yes, we need more engineers, we need more dentists, we need doctors. But, you know, a lot of degrees... And funny enough, I went with my daughter to a university open day, and I embarrassed her by asking the question, how many of your graduates get jobs? And they said...
Good question.
95% get jobs in molecular genetics. It's a demand. There's demand for that. But many other courses, the jobs aren't there for them, and people have got lots of debt, but they haven't got those high-paid jobs to pay back the debt. So it's actually costing the taxpayer money, because eventually that debt will be written off.
Yeah, but you say you're concerned. Rishi Sunak's talking about crackdown. What's he going to do? What's he suggesting here?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what he says, but he's identified the problem. There is a problem that people are graduating with degrees that aren't... yeah, they've got good degrees, they may have worked very hard, but it doesn't lead them into a successful job which allows them to build their lives and, incidentally, to pay back the debt that they've taken on.
Right, but the regulator... the Office for Students already has the power to investigate and sanction universities if degrees fall below set minimum performance thresholds. Now, the metrics, excuse the numbers, these include 75% of students completing the course and 60% going on to further study or professional work within 15 months of graduating. So that's in place. So what's the crackdown?
Well, I mean, that is high dropout rate is a really alarm bell ringing. Maybe I think the regulator needs to be looking more carefully at what's going on to ensure, you know, we're not doing these young people a big favour saying, yes, go and study for 3 years, give up, 3 years of your career, when there are other options, for example, apprenticeships where you get paid. I've got apprentices in my constituency earning good money by the time that they're the same age as their friends are graduating and with no debt.
It sounds like a press release, but not with much substance behind it. But do you agree with the principle that rip-off degrees, as Rishi Sunak calls them, well, I don't know, should be got rid of?
Well, I read that as Rishi Sunak trying to close the door to university for lots of students. Now, there might be problems around quality, and the regulators should deal with that. There's definitely problems about contact time and how much you get for the money that you pay and for student debt, and that's a separate issue. But I'm very proud of Labour's record of having more people go to university. I would not have gone to university because people like me didn't go to university had it not been for a Labour government saying that we should. And actually, the future economy is going to require high levels of skills, high levels of creativity and innovation. I'd be really interested to see what the Tories think are kind of, what language did he use? Rip-off degrees. I mean, they've taken out creativity from the national curriculum in schools, and I think that will be to the detriment of economic growth in the future.
But what about those courses that fall below those metrics? What about those that only deliver 40% of their students with jobs at the end of it? Should they be cut out of universities?
Well, it depends. The regulator needs to make sure that the courses are good quality for the students paying for it, absolutely. And if there's a problem there, that should be fixed. I'm the first to say that we need to reform regulators.
But you say you should go to university,
working.
come what may. It is still an aspirational thing to do, whatever you study.
Well, there are lots of different types of degrees that add lots of different types of value. My concern about this is it's saying that they're going to reduce the number of places at university, which means restricting access to higher education for people that deserve access.
Well, I think other people, David Goodhart and others, have written about that there is an overproduction of the graduate class. And actually, we are at a time when we have staff shortages in many high-skilled manual labour and others. And I think there's a lot of people that have been funnelled into university that otherwise would have had great careers in other vocational areas without having the massive debt on top of it. So I do worry about the fact that more than 50% now of young people are being pushed into university, which is actually contributing to... We were talking about generational resentment. Many people are leaving universities expecting to get these great jobs. They're not getting it and therefore feel quite resentful about the fact that they're in non-professional jobs 3 or 4 years later.
But is that the fault of the university, or is that the fault of the government, who has not been able to create a high-wage economy and so the jobs just aren't there? It's not necessarily a fault of the education system.
Well, I do think that there are some universities in the country that are, for example, relying very heavily on kind of international students to kind of prop up these universities. And if they weren't there, that these universities may not even exist. So I do think there is something to be looked at about some of these universities.
And also having a conversation about the interest rate that has been applied to student loans. I mean, that is one of the biggest scandals that have faced students in, forever? And instead, the Prime Minister is talking about, going down the culture war route of Mickey Mouse degrees and suggesting that universities are at fault. What about all of the debt that has been accumulated because the government have not looked after student loans?
I think we need better careers advice at school. And I think if, people embarking on a university degree, it might be helpful for them to know, what the average starting wage is for the graduates on that course, how many people get into a job that actually directly relates to that course. Because we're not saying fewer should go to university, we're saying people should do courses that lead them into high-paid jobs. That means they can pay off their loans, they can get on the housing ladder, they can do all those things that people should be able to do with a degree.
They can't pay off their loans. That's a really big... I think it's really important to say there are hardly anyone who will ever be able to pay a £50,000 loan back, especially when the interest rate variable is between 9 and 12% a year.
Has there been too much...
an engineering degree, chemical engineers, there's lots of very well-paid jobs, there's tremendous demand out there, and when you talk to employers, they think we just can't get people with those degrees that we need because people are maybe going to courses that they might think are a little bit easier.
They're going abroad because the salaries are better. We don't live in a high-wage economy at the moment, so they are leaving.
Has there been too much of a push for people to go to university, though, Darren?
There's definitely been students who have gone through university thinking they would get rewarded for that and not being rewarded in the way they thought they were going to be, although the average salary, I understand, is higher. There's definitely been less of a focus on technical training, and I support good quality apprenticeships, especially the university degree apprenticeships that can lead to good quality jobs. All of that's perfectly legitimate. But my concern about this announcement is the signal it sends to working class kids, like I used to be in my constituency where I represent now, saying that unless you're from a background where you think you can become a lawyer, a doctor, an architect or whatever, university is not for you. I think that's to the detriment of the country.
I don't think that message is being sent. Actually, if you look at a lot of Russell Group universities, they've done a lot in recent years in order to...
Not enough.
Well, you can argue not enough, but there has been moves in order to increase accessibility for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I do think that, as far as I understand, this policy isn't to target Russell Group universities, but I do think we have to look at... That's not the only good university, but I do think we have to look at the fact that too many people are being funnelled into university where they could actually earn earn much more and succeed way better if they do.
So let me give you an example locally. I think what you've just said is it's not going to target Russell Group University. So if you want to become an engineer at Bristol University, you're fine. But if you want to study creative arts at the University of the West of England, a former polytechnic where I did my law degree, maybe that's not okay. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think that that's what I'm saying. I think you have to just look at whether or not this is producing the kinds of things that these students expected. And actually, if there are other routes, whether that's apprenticeships, vocational training in other areas, then why should we not also encourage them to do that?
We agree on reform. I think what I'm saying is it shouldn't restrict access to people. That's the difference. And that's what I think this announcement's really about.
And he also needs to define what a decent job is. What are the parameters of that? I mean, I studied English literature, and a lot of people think that's a Mickey Mouse degree. Should I not be sitting here?
Well, I think, many people regard that as a great degree as well. I don't necessarily
Not
think
online. You should see the messages, honestly.
On that note, a reminder we have 3 by-elections in England this week in Selby and Ainsty, Somerton and Frome, and Uxbridge and South Ruislip. I'll be presenting a special results programme with lots of coffee on Thursday night from midnight on BBC One and BBC News. Please keep me and my guests that night company. Let's talk about loneliness. You heard there again in the headlines. University students, as we were talking about, are likely to experience loneliness. Nearly 1 in 4 students feel lonely all or most of the time. This according to recent figures from the Office for National Statistics. However, the figure for 16 to 29-year-olds is the highest of all age groups and over twice that of over 70s. But why? Let's take a look at this report by our reporter Eman Warridge.
I'm lonely, and when I felt chronic loneliness, I felt like the walls were caving in on me.
With loneliness, it felt almost like a void, like everyone describes it to be, but this void is completely never-ending.
When you imagine a lonely person, who do you think about? For me, I imagined an older person, yet through my research I've discovered that the loneliest age group are actually 16 to 24-year-olds. I've been speaking to some of them to find out why.
Loneliness was so different from just being alone. Being alone is fine. Being lonely is soul-ripping. I'm a social extrovert. Like, my extroversion knows no bounds, except lockdown. Even after I stopped shielding, there was a good 8 months where I still couldn't even leave the house because I had no reason to. I had no one to see, nowhere to go. And when I had nothing else to do, that's when it really hit that, like, I'm lonely.
I've felt lonely on a number of occasions, and I suspect that everybody goes through periods of loneliness. What I would like, though, is to see the stigma around loneliness go on the same journey that the stigma we used to have about talking about mental health has gone through. And actually there are a number of helplines that varying charities run.
When I tried to contact them, it would be such a long wait line on the phone that by the time this was at a point of crisis that I didn't have time to wait around. It was an emergency. However, even when I did get through to the helplines, it was a very inadequate service.
We've seen hundreds of youth centres close, we've seen thousands of youth worker jobs being lost in recent years. Those safe spaces for young people to go when they're not at home or at school are being lost. And increasingly we need investment in youth services where young people are, and increasingly providing youth work in the digital spaces where young people are spending their time too.
I put claims of cuts to services for young people to the Minister.
We have embarked on a major funding exercise, a massive project. We're doing a national youth guarantee. This will guarantee that every young person by 2025 will have access to a club, will have access to experiences away from home.
You know that you want to speak to someone, but then you can't even get the courage or bravery or even self-confidence or self-esteem to reach out to someone, and it's like a cycle, and then obviously from that point you then withdraw yourself even more, and it just keeps getting worse and worse until you're at a crisis point.
Are you surprised, Ava, it's such a problem for this young age group?
No, I think it's definitely an onslaught from the pandemic and people being stuck inside and not being able to go to classes or socialise properly. But it's also an issue with mental health services and how they have been decimated and there are 2-year wait lists. The other problem is for women as well, because women are stereotyped and not necessarily believed when they're complaining about how they feel. I think that women aren't taken quite as seriously. There's been a big push to believe young men, and women are now trailing behind. And there was new research out this morning which showed that a young woman was taking her own life once every 2 days. I mean, that is an extraordinary figure.
Robert, what do you say about the cuts to services, mental health services, but also in the film there to youth clubs?
Well, I mean, certainly in my constituency, there's no shortage of things for young people to do. We've got Scouts and Guides, we've got Sea Cadets, there's all sorts of sporting, you know, our rugby club, our football club, all have youth engagement policies. I think the problem seems to be that people sort of just retreat from social life and get themselves sort of fixed in that situation. I think the pandemic certainly started it, and I think working from home also is something that's really difficult. You know, in many organisations, the senior middle management who have families love working from home. You know, if you're a single person in a single bedroom flat, working from home is an absolute nightmare. I mean, certainly, you know, in our part of the world, going down the pub is usually the solution to loneliness, and maybe we've lost that sort of tradition as well.
I mean, I often worry about the way in which youth services are often framed as this kind of panacea for all problems as it relates to young people. When we hear about issues to do with knife crime, people talk about the decimation of youth services. I think actually, in terms of proportion of young people that use youth services, I think that's actually relatively small. I think when it comes to loneliness, it's a much broader cultural and social issue, such as the fact that communities have kind of fragmented, pubs are closing down, churches, institutions that would bring people away from just their immediate family members to other parts of the community have increasingly gone. And so young people retreat to social media, which is not that real in-person sense of relationships. And I think that that's really unfortunate.
I mean, that's one of the interesting problems, actually, is around social media. We don't get enough research on the data from the tech companies because the tech companies don't let us have access to their data. It's one of the things we tried to put in the online safety bill, because it'll be really interesting to understand that where the social media platforms have kind of increased the dopamine hit from your social media use, if you're then not on social media, do you then suffer a kind of downer as a consequence of that? And one of the really interesting areas of new policy, which I think will be particularly relevant to this generation, is the idea of artificially intelligent friends, or AI friends. So you might get into a position where, because the AI can now have a conversation with you, either in text or in audio, you might have fake friends. And what does that mean for your mental health and for social policy?
Big in Japan. Already taken off in Japan. Huge.
And is it a good thing?
Well, no, I mean obviously not. But I mean, you know, the internet runs away with itself. And if you look at our online safety bill, it's so incredibly inadequate. It's not even addressing any of the AI issues that we're going to have in the next 5 to 10 years. Parliament is so behind what is actually going on.
I mean, is government really equipped to deal with this broad issue of what are affecting young people and loneliness and social media? Or is it just much more complex and societal in the way
I agree with Darren, it is very complex. I think one area that does concern me, the number of children who just don't attend school. They may be described as homeschooling. You know, in some cases, very good education being delivered at home. In many cases, you know, the children have anxiety issues. They don't want to engage. They maybe had some bullying, which that means, you know, they can't cope with. So, you know, I think in the educational sector, I think we really do need to look at these children who aren't going to school, who aren't getting education, and they aren't having a social life, which, you know, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be sort of without mates, you know, to talk to go down the pub to, you know, even mates in the Labour Party. You know, we get on very well, all of us.
Might get so desperate, might be talking to you about the...
don't tell the viewers we get on, but I'll lose some votes. But the Child Appropriate Design Code, getting a bit technical,
yeah, what's
but
that?
This is a kind of legal measure that says that all of these tech platforms need to be built with the concepts of protecting children from the very beginning, not afterwards. And we've got to make sure that that's the new normal for these reasons.
I think there is also a danger in thinking that, you know, a technical solution with social media will solve it. I think it's something in the social fabric. And actually, relative to other countries, for example, in Scandinavia, we have quite low levels of social trust. And I think that that's been getting worse across the generations. I think we have to look at how we rebuild bonds within communities and not just think that social media will deal with it.
That's difficult for Parliament to fix. I don't disagree.
Well,
but how you fix social trust, you can't do that with a law.
It comes back round to funding, doesn't it? It comes back round to funding public services.
Not always about money.
Well, yeah, and
Not
creating areas where people can gather and can mix. I mean, if you think about even like local parks being shut down, which has happened over the last 10 years, where are teenagers meant to go?
Well, let me just show you this. If you want to get in contact with BBC Action Line, bbc.co.uk/Action Line, you've got the number there, and the lines are open 24 hours a day, and all calls are free. That's it for today, and thank you very much to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But from all of us, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.